Hello everyone, and welcome back to RRS Live. My name is Jesse Mullins, and welcome to Trials on Trial in Economic Study. I'm working with Dr. Pan Jindapan in the Economics, Finance, and Legal Studies Department. Today we're going to go over the goals of our research before delving into some background on contests and the legal framework that we'll be investigating, before going over our experiment model and an extended example of one of our experiment variations, then how we're actually going to conduct the study, namely the application we'll be using and the Tide Lab that will be hosting it, before finishing out with future steps. The goals of our research are to complete a literature review and to design a Tide Lab study to investigate the implications of English rule versus American rule as they relate to a client's willingness to bring a case to court, and then run the Tide Lab study and compile and analyze the results. So now for a little background on contests. As you can see, a contest is a game where contestants exert costly and irretrievable effort in order to win one or more prizes with some probability. A good example of this is a lottery, where you expend money in order to buy a ticket, which represents your effort in order to win the jackpot, the prize, with some probability. Another example is a political campaign, where candidates exert money in order to advertise themselves in order to win an elected office. Yet another is litigation, which is what we are most interested in, where a client hires a lawyer, which represents their effort, in order to win the case with some probability. Also note that the expense does not have to be monetary, as is the case with sports or studying, in which case someone can expend their own time in order to study or practice in order to win, say, a scholarship or a playoff game. The elements of the contest include a list of contestants, effort for each of the contestants, a prize that they're trying to win, and a mapping of effort to probability, meaning that as you change the level of effort each contestant puts forward, how it impacts their odds of winning the prize. And a cost function of effort. Going back to our lottery example, if a ticket costs $1, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. However, if that same ticket costs $2, $3, or even $5, we can see that it would affect the willingness of a participant to expend greater levels of effort. And risk attitudes, which show whether or not a participant is risk-averse or willing to take risks in order to win the prize. This can be measured as well as influenced by the parameters of a given study. Now on to our legal background. Primarily the difference between English and American rule. In an English rule system, the losing party pays both parties legal fees. Meanwhile, in the American rule system, each party pays their own, regardless of winning or losing. The primary purpose for the English rule system is to discourage frivolous cases from being brought to court, meaning that if they have a low probability of success or are seen without merit, they would be less likely to be brought to court because a plaintiff, the person that brings a case to court, understands that in the event that they lose, they have to pay both parties legal fees. Meanwhile, the American rule system is structured to encourage people to bring cases to court without the fear of having to pay steep legal fees for both parties. Before we roll into our experiment model, we'll go over one last thing, the difference between random and dictated income. Now, random income, as it might sound, is randomly determined at the start of an experiment, while a dictated game has one player allocating manually resources both to themselves and their opponent. In our experiment, both parties' income summed to be 100. So for example, in a random income game, if one party receives 47 points, the other would receive 53. In a dictator game, player A could choose to give themselves 70 points and 30 points to their opponent. Now onto our experiment model. It consists of a 3-stage game between 2 players, with each player having an initial wealth of 100 and a primary source of conflict being dictated versus random income, which we'll go over even more later, and the parameters being English or American rule. So now on to our experiment model, a general overview. As you can see in stage 1, each player's income is determined, and as we went over before, that could be either random or dictated. And then we roll into stage 2, where player B, representing the plaintiff, can choose whether or not to declare a contest prize. Now what that means is if player B is unhappy with the amount of money that they received in stage 1, they can choose to sue, declaring a contest prize for an amount of money they want to take from player A. If they're happy with the amount of money that they received, they can choose not to sue at all, declaring a zero contest prize, and the game would end immediately. However, if they do sue, we move on to stage 3, where the two parties compete for the contest prize, either to take it from player A or to retain it. Now we go into an example of our game. For this example, we're going to look at a dictated income game under the English rule. So in stage 1, as we said before, the defendant will allocate the starting income. So let's say that they give 70 points to themselves and 30 to their opponent. We then move on to stage 2, the contest prize, where the plaintiff, player B, has the opportunity to declare a prize. Once again, if they were happy with those 30 points that they received, they could end the game right then and there. But for the purposes of this experiment, let's assume that they're unhappy and want more. So they declare a 35-point contest prize, meaning that they want to take 35 points from player A. And we move on to stage 3, where each player puts forward effort to win a contest, this effort representing the legal fees in a litigation. The odds of a given player winning are equal to their effort divided by the sum of both players' efforts. So for example, if player A puts forward 10 points and player B puts forward 30, player A would have a 10 over 40 or 25% chance of winning the case. Meanwhile, player B has a 30 over 40 or 75% chance of winning the case. So now let's look at what the actual winnings would be. If player A, the defendant, wins, they take their initial wealth of 100 plus their income of 70 and they keep it, having won the case. And if player B wins, they get their 100 initial wealth plus their income for the round, 130, plus the declared contest prize, the winnings of the case, for a total of 165. If player A were to lose, they'd have that 100 initial wealth and the 70 income, but subtracted from it would be the losings of the case, those 35 points, and both parties' legal fees, since it's under an English rule system, which totaled to 40. And player B, likewise, were they to lose, would pay both parties' legal fees and fail to get the 35-point winnings for the case. So as you can see, we have a 2x2 design, either English or American rule, and random and dictated income. We saw DE, the bottom right here, but there are 3 other variations to this experiment. By analyzing the trends and the differences between these different variations, we can see what combination promotes the highest likelihood that a case gets brought to court and the experiment fulfills. The way that we're actually going to conduct this study is by implementing the services of the TIDE Lab, which is a behavioral lab here on campus. They're able to give structured experiments for monetary reward to participants here on campus. And they have a lot of different applications, but the one that we are most interested in are the computer labs, which allow us to run Z-Tree, which is a program that helps us run economic experiments like the one we've described here. On the right here, you can see a back-end view of what actually designing the experiment looks like, where we can run multiple times for reliability. Future steps include finishing creation of the actual experiment, scheduling and running the study, and then compiling and analyzing the results. Any questions?
So you talked about how you're setting up the experiment. Do you have any hypotheses as to what will happen after you run it?
So as we kind of went over before, typically what's seen in the English rule system is a discouraged chance of bringing a case to court, and the opposite is true in the American system. So what we might predict to see is a trend that more cases, more contests are declared under an American rule than an English rule system. But obviously we want to test with the different variations of what those trends might also show.
What made you interested in comparing the American and English systems?
So it's very interesting to see what the actual impacts of these systems are on the legal system. And we've had the American rule system in place a very long time here in the country, but there are niche cases where we can see the impacts of different systems and the merits of both. So being able to look into the strengths and weaknesses of both systems help us choose what the strongest and most valuable choices would be moving forward as we continue towards moves towards equity and fairness in our legal system.
Can you talk a little bit more in the dictated game? What would stop someone, the dictator, from just choosing to allocate all 100 points to themselves every single turn?
Yes. So were player A to give 100 points to themselves and 0 to their opponent, it would guarantee that that second player would absolutely sue, bringing up a case and then declaring a contest prize. Now, the contest prize can be set up to the amount that player A keeps. So in that event, player B could choose to set a 100-point contest prize. And during the actual contest, each player can put forward up to 50 points, which is half of their initial endowment. So if both players maximized their chances, at best, they would have 50-50 chance of winning. So if player A were to take all 100 points for themselves, there's a good possibility that they end up with nothing. And through repeated uses of this experiment, they would likely see that and try and think more strategically about how to balance that.
Thank you, Jesse.